let's see. I'm going to go ahead and bring Carl up here, who is going to introduce Dana. So thank you.
Good morning. So we are privileged and lucky today to have with us Dana Gioia. Dana is a renowned poet, critic, and nonfiction writer. He has 6 poetry collections, and all published not independently, so which is quite an accomplishment.
Yes.
His book Interrogations at Noon won the American Book Award. One of his more recent books, 99 Poems, won the Poets Prize. And he also has been in the literary business of sorts. He was chairman of the National Endowment of the Arts from 2003 to 2009, and he was California Poet Laureate from 2015 to 2019. Now, as if that isn't enough, he is also very famous for having written an article in The Atlantic a number of years ago called "Can Poetry Matter?"
No.
And so he understands the dilemmas that many poets find themselves in these days. So he also has a number of books here to sell during the break or afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dana to speak. Thank you.
I try to make it a point whenever I give a poetry reading or a talk to read someone else's poems but my own. And I try to think today, what would it be interesting to read or recite? And I thought I would pick the most unfashionable poet possible, who, for that very reason, is also one of the greatest, American poets, which is Edna St. Vincent Millay. There has been no American poet who wrote better love poems than hers. And I just tried to remember her, the poems. And one of the poems came to mind, and I think it goes like this. It's a very early poem called "Time Does Not Bring Relief." Time does not bring relief. You all have lied, who told me time would ease me of my pain. I miss him in the falling of the rain. I want him in the shrinking of the tide. The old snows melt on every mountainside, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. But last year's bitter loving must remain heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. There are 100 places where I fear to go. So with his memory they brim, and entering with relief, some quiet place where never fell his foot or shone his face, I say, there is no memory of him here. And so stand stricken, so remembering him. I think she's hot stuff, but academically she's not respectable. I want to be very frank about this. Okay, I got to stand frank. I'm a very famous person in American culture. I'm a famous poet. I'm a famous critic. I'm a person people quote, and people assume that there was some intricate and organized plan that accounts for that. I'll have to squeeze this way so I don't fall out of camera frame. And what I wanted to talk about today, I want to read some poems and just talk about how haphazard my life has been. We all know there's a way of becoming a poet. You major in English or creative writing, you get an MFA in creative writing, you get a fellowship, and then you spend the rest of your life teaching creative writing. That career path, there must be, I don't know, 30,000 instructors of creative writing now, maybe more like 50,000. And I think that career path is responsible for the torpor of American poetry. And I think that, most writers happen through a combination of their ambition, which is internal and private and invisible, and just the accidents of their lives. Things happen in your life which call you to certain responses. Now, I was born in Hawthorne, California. I don't know if you know Hawthorne. It's, it's
Small.
Famous because Jim Thorpe died there. The Beach Boys were born and raised there. And Quentin Tarantino filmed much of Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown there. And he caught the questionable charm of the place. It's a rough working class town. My mother was Mexican, my dad was Sicilian. I was raised among immigrants. Nobody had ever gone to college. And I was a kind of dreamy kid. This sounds like it's the beginning of a gay narrative, because I was different from the other boys. But in my case, it took the form of, I would hear music and it would just overwhelm me. I would see a reproduction of painting or something, and everybody would say, "Oh, well, no," they would move on. And for me, it would just strike me in my place. My mother was not a woman of much education, and indeed, both of my grandfathers had only gone to 4th grade. Never met the grandmother on the Mexican side because she died of cancer when my mother was a little girl. My Sicilian grandmother, who lived next door, was illiterate. She could not even sign her own name. So these are the people I came from, who were smart people, who were good people, but were not by any, even the most liberal definition, educated people. My mother had gone to school in those horrifying, oppressive days when to torture children, they made them memorize poems. I can hardly believe America was once that cruel. And these poems were sort of precious to her. And my Mexican grandfather had been a vaquero, a cowboy, as his father, and they had done poetry. There was a sort of a sense of poetry on my mother's side. And we would be doing housework together at chores, and she would suddenly go, "It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. And we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee." And when my mother would recite these poems, not all of them, but the ones that I liked, I would go into a state of altered consciousness. I don't mean like, an acid trip or something, but I was pulled out of the mundane and rather ugly world that I lived in. And actually, my most recent book, which I don't have copies of here today, the only copies I've had is sold, called Poetry as Enchantment. I realized that what poetry is, like what song is, what most art is a form of enchantment. It tries to create a mild hypnotic state that does what hypnosis does. It increases your retention, your attention, your vulnerability, your openness. And so I always wanted to dwell in the enchantments of music, of poetry, of art, of storytelling. This was not much encouraged in the 1950s in working class Los Angeles, and so I had a kind of hidden private life, and I went through it, and I was always very comfortable about having 2 lives. I went on to college, and by then I was sure I would be a musician. A composer is really what I wanted to be. I lacked the specific talent and certainly the discipline to do this, but that takes a fellow a few years to realize, because I was passably good they wouldn't kick me out of the symphony. And I went to Stanford. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college. And I was very unhappy at Stanford. And then I saw that there was a girl I kind of liked who was going to Europe. She didn't think much of me. And I saw that there was a program I could sign up for, and my California scholarship, state scholarship, would apply to in Vienna. So on a whim, on one day, without thinking about it, I went off for a year to Vienna to study music. And if you think I was unhappy in California, you can only imagine what what it was like in Vienna. My German was good, but not so good that I could mix invisibly with the locals. And I began doing music, and the more I was with music, the more I realized that two things, which was first of all the limit of my own talent, but also the fact that the kind of music that I was encouraged to compose was atonal, serial, electronic music, and it had nothing to do with, and I'll use the most obscene word in arts vocabulary, it had no beauty. And beauty was a concept that was completely alien, and it took me 20 years to figure out what that meant in my own life. But I knew instinctively I didn't want to write that kind of music. And it was a game, it was an intellectual game. And then, but I was reading poems. I was reading poems in German. Der du von der Himmel bist, alles Leid und Schmerzen stillst. Du doppelt elend ist, doppelt mit Erquickung füllst. Ach, ich bin des Treibens müde, was soll all das Schmerz und Lust? Süßer Friede, komm, ach, komm in meiner Brust. That's Goethe. And I love these things. I actually, began, and I just, all unhappy intellectual young men scribble poems, and the girls probably do it twice as much as we do it, so it's a universal, human, I guess, cry for help that you do. And so I was doing this, and then one morning in Vienna, without any preparation, I woke up and I was thinking of the day, and I realized that I was going to be a poet, that being a poet was my life work. Now I have to tell you, this is not something that was pondered upon. It took me by surprise, and it brought me to two questions, which is, first of all, what does it mean to be a poet? Well, I guess it means to get an MFA and teach creative writing, but it didn't appeal to me. And the other was that if you're going to be a poet and you're not going to teach creative writing, especially if you have absolutely no money, and your parents have no money, and what my parents had was a lot more kids. I was the oldest. How do you make a living? Yeah. And those are two things that, to this day, I still think about. So every poet I met was a professor, so I said, well, I'll be a professor. So I finished Stanford, but from that moment on, I led my life to be a poet, which is to say, to be a student of literature, to be someone who is attentive to the mysteries of life. And that, I read a wonderful definition by the French philosopher Jacques Maritain about beauty. And this strikes me as what poetry is: the secrets of existence radiating onto the intelligence. And I think that's right, because it's not just our intellectual intelligence. What poetry is really the oldest art that is still practiced. It's a way of speaking which is different than the way we're trained to speak at the university. At university we're trained to speak analytically, conceptually, about things as abstractions, as things in a social context which we can all understand. But what poetry does is it doesn't separate the body from the mind, the emotions from the imagination, the analytical intelligence from the intuition. It's a holistic way of speaking about our own existence. Now, is that odd? No, because that's the way we go through life. I meet somebody I have an impression, 5 minutes later my impression changes, they do something, this, that, and the other, and it's this kind of holistic thing that I'm trying to intuitively make sense of. Laurette says it's preconceptual language. It's language you haven't been able to, to pin a thought on yet, but you feel. Now, that is not the way that I ever had poetry taught to me. In fact, had poetry taught to me exactly the opposite, as a kind of high-level, analytical, conceptual language. And if you were smart enough, laden, with allusions and symbols and images and things like this. And so I went to graduate school, and in graduate school, I was fortunate to have two wonderful teachers. One of them, I think you probably heard of, is Elizabeth Bishop. She was my teacher, and became a very good friend. The other one was Robert Fitzgerald, who you probably know from his translations of Homer, Virgil, Sophocles, even did a Euripides poem. And neither of them had gone to graduate school, neither of them, and they were really oddballs at Harvard grad school, or was. And then I just decided to quit. And then I had to make a living, so I decided I had shit jobs since I was 9. I was 9 when one of my Italian uncles took me to a construction site and put me to work, because Italians and Mexicans, my two families, both understand that left to their own devices, boys get into trouble. So anyway, so I decided I went to Stanford Business School. I am the first person, perhaps the only person in human history that went to Stanford Business School to be a poet. And so, at Stanford Business School, I had 3 accomplishments. I spent 3 hours every day reading and writing, and I began writing reviews and poems and things like that. So I entered my literary life, as it were, at Stanford Business School. Secondly, I, believe it or not, got an MBA. I would be willing to bet that no student was ever awarded an MBA at Stanford doing less than I did. I had whatever the micro measure just above failing was where I occupied. And you have no idea how wonderful that is. I had, in my whole life, been trained to be the best student in the class, to be the A student. And then suddenly I realized how everybody else lived, and how wonderful, how much smarter they were than I had been. And then the third thing is I met my wife, or I met the woman that I would marry. I knew pretty quickly I wanted to marry her. It took her 5 years to come to the same conclusion. That's another story. And then I went and I got a business job. And for the next 15 years, I wrote every night and every weekend, and I worked 10 hours a day, at the office. And that would have probably continued until I retired, except that my wife and I, who delayed having children, had a beautiful boy who was born, who then died at 4 months of sudden infant death syndrome. And those of us who have lost children or have lost siblings know what that does to you. And I realized that, I would, we had 2 more kids born, and once my wife was pregnant with our younger son, who's now 32, I just told her I was going to quit. And I was going to make myself a living as a writer. Now, I was lucky because in the meantime, I had published an article called Can Poetry Matter, which made me internationally famous. Wow. Was not, and then I had, about the same time, I published my first book of poems. I think this just died. I think the battery is gone here. I can fill the room up while you replace the battery.
No, your batteries? We don't have batteries at the desk.
I think the battery is.
Yeah, but
wait, is it coming back on?
Maybe just hit it off.
Okay.
Just hit it off.
Okay.
Lucky.
I must have pressed it. Sorry. And so I quit, and yeah, I think it's.
Go ahead and keep talking, and I'll just get to the
I have no problem filling a room of this size. In fact, if you can all hear me, we don't even need the microphone unless it's for the camera. So I quit, and without a plan, and I just trusted things would happen. And I was thinking of what I wanted to talk today about, and I thought the things that I wanted to talk about, and I've already been talking about them, are fidelity, patience, and friendship. And I had been faithful to my calling, fidelity. I mean, I'd always said that I was a poet, everything else was just a job. And even though I had an extremely high-powered job, it was just a job. And the moment I left it, I regretted not getting the paycheck every month, but I didn't regret anything else. And I liked the people, I had done good work, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just put myself out in the world, and bit by bit things came. And after about a year and a half, we were doing really very well again. I was working for the BBC as their American correspondent. I began doing textbooks. I began, continued writing poems. I began coming to working with musicians, which has become a big thing in my life. And so I then found myself, and it's continued on there, and I ended up really quite by accident not wanting the job as chairman of the NEA. I turned down the chance to be nominated and everything twice. A whole nother story about that, which I won't bore you. But when I was in Washington, I was able to do a lot of good things. One of which you probably have some familiarity with, Poetry Out Loud.
Oh, yeah.
I created Poetry Out Loud at the NEA so that we could have a national high school arts program. And I'm happy to say that next month I will go to Washington and celebrate the 20th anniversary of Poetry Out Loud. So, we'll have to figure out how to continue it if bad things happen in Washington. But that's we will,
Yes.
because I have fidelity, I have faith, and I also have friendship. I have people, that I can put together. We can put together the funding or the network to do. That's not another thing. So anyway, finally, after 20 years in New York, where I was, I was very successful in New York. I was one of the inner circle of American poetry, and I just didn't like it. Everybody was trying to make a deal, and so I decided, once again, I just walked away from that life. And my parents had moved to Sebastopol in 1975, and so I brought my wife, my horrified wife, my bewildered kids to my wife has always loved everywhere we've moved outside of California, although she's a Californian, and so anyway. And I moved to where I still live, on top of a hill on Font Road. And I like people. I go after things because they give me joy or I believe in them. I have been fortunate to make a living as a poet, but I've never gone after money. And it's worked out. And I think that everybody in this room is an oddball. I mean, if you were a normal person, you wouldn't be here this morning. And you just got to accept that about yourself. And and it's. I'll end with, before then I'll go into my poems. I want to end with one of the things I noticed I noticed it in high school, but I couldn't make sense of it until I was the chairman of the NEA. You're 15, you're a weirdo, you're 15 too, you're like, we don't like the guys, they don't like us, the pretty girls are picking on us, the cool girls are things. Not said that you won't both the word beautiful at that age, but you probably didn't recognize it. So you don't know what to do, so you end up, they're doing a play, and you say, well, I'll go in the play, maybe I can't, and then you try out for the play, you don't get a part, but maybe, or you get a small part, or you end up in the crew. And so you're there, and you're there just because you haven't found your tribe.
Yeah.
So you're there, and you're looking around, and you go, these kids are weird. And then you go another week or two into it, and you go, well, these kids are weird, but I kind of like some of them.
Yeah.
And then, especially if you're part of the actors, you're now maybe a month into it, you're getting close to when it's starting, and you go, I'm learning stuff that I didn't learn elsewhere. It's weird stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I'm pretending to be somebody, or I'm painting scenery or whatever. But it's kind of interesting, and I feel good about these people. These people are like me. And then you put the play on, and you do all your weird crap in front of the people that you think don't like you. And what do? They applaud. Because you've had, and this is why we need arts in schools. We need to have more than one way to find your adult self, more than sports and school government, for a social unit, and ways where different people can find different definitions of themselves. So long before I decided to move here, actually, right after my parents moved here, they were on a chicken farm in Sebastopol. I came up here, and I've been raised in just urban, ugly Los Angeles. I'd hardly seen a tree until I was in college. And I was here with a girl that I was, this is a theme of my early life, a girl I was in love with who he had, shall I say, mixed feelings about me. And so we were up here, and it was about this time of year. And I had, see if I can find, I think I know it by heart, but it always helps to find the actual poem. And so we just started walking through these orchards behind my parents' house. And I'd never, I'm going to find the poem here. In order to find the poem, I need to have my glasses. Here it is, 185. And I was just overwhelmed by it. And that night, I went back in my notebook. I wrote about 2 or 3 lines, and then I couldn't figure out where they went. So they stayed in my notebook. So for about every couple of years, I would come across them, and I'd say, well, there's a real poem there. And I'd try to write it, and it just wouldn't do. And then about 30 years afterwards, I think I had moved back here. I looked at it, and I knew exactly where it would go. So there'll be a 30-year plus year gap between the first 2 lines and the rest of the poem. But ironically, those 30 years made the first 2 lines truer than they would have been. It's called The Apple Orchard. You won't remember it. The apple orchard we wandered through one April afternoon, climbing the hill beside the India farm. A city boy, I'd never seen a grove burst in full flower or breathe the bitter-sweet perfume of blossoms mingled with the dust. A quarter-mile of trees and fragrant rose arching above us, we walked the aisle, alone in spring's ephemeral cathedral. We had the luck, if you can call it that, of having been in love, but never lovers. The bright flame burning, fed by pure desire, nothing consumed, such secrets brought to light. There was a moment when I stood behind you, reached out to spin you toward me, but I stopped. What more could I have wanted from that day? Everything, of course. Perhaps that was the point, to learn that what we will not grasp is lost. So I go back to what did I say? My themes were fidelity, patience, and friendship. And so, it took 35 years to write. It's actually This is the only poem of mine that's been made into a cartoon. It's been made a beautiful setting that somebody wanted to do an animated version of the cartoon. So you can, if you look up the Apple Orchard, I think you have to do the composer's name. It's on YouTube. You can see this British cartoon or British animated film, I guess. So I bet my element of chance in my poems. Now, for years, because if you know anything about me as a poet, you know that I am notorious for having done an unforgivable thing, revived meter, revived rhyme, and revived sort of non-autobiographical storytelling, sort of narrative poetry. And I was often attacked for my sonnets. Now, the interesting thing was I had never published a sonnet. But it was an easy thing to attain. If you didn't want to read my poetry, you knew as a formalist, well, I must be posing. So finally, I felt that I really needed to write a sonnet just to be fair to my enemies. And so I had a poem that was about it was sort of hovering between 13 and 15 lines, and so I made it 14 on principle. It's called The Road, which is to say it's based on probably one of the oldest metaphors in poetry. He sometimes felt that he had missed his life by being far too busy looking for it. Searching the distance, he often turned to find that he had passed some milestone unawares. And other people were walking next to him. First friends, then lovers, now children and a wife. They were good company, generous, kind, but equally bewildered to be there. He noticed then that no one chose the way. All seemed to drift by some collective will. The path grew easier with each passing day because it was worn and mostly sloped downhill. The road ahead seemed hazy in the gloom. Where was it he had meant to go? And with whom? Now, one of the pleasures of my life, and this is interesting, is that I spend a lot of my time really working with composers because they see my poetry, they want to set it to music, or they want to write songs. And so there's a jazz pianist you may have heard. She's performed twice at the Healdsburg Jazz Festival, Helen Sung. And Helen wanted to do a vocal album, and she asked me to write, if I wanted to write some lyrics, and I said, well, it sounds like a good, then she got a grant to do a jazz song cycle. And I said, well, what is a jazz song cycle? And so we had to figure that out. So this was the first lyric that I wrote for her. It's a very LA poem, because LA is where the beautiful people go. And if you're beautiful enough, you can just make your living off being beautiful, respectably or not. And the beautiful people have a kind of power. There was a term that's come into play actually after I wrote the poem called pretty privilege. And it's a terrible moment when someone loses that. And so this is a poem about beauty and what happens to it. And it was written, I wanted to write a poem that was written both for music and for the page. It's called Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10 out of 10, the drop-dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's gone lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. Once again, you know, it's the haphazard nature of reality. I wrote a poem, and I would defy you at the end of this to say, well, that poem is crying out to be set to music. Although it immediately was, but more interestingly, I'll read it to you, and I want to tell you a story about something that happened. It's called Finding a Box of Family Letters. You know, I never read this to college kids because they haven't gone through the experience, but you know, when you lose your parents, you know, you go through their stuff, and it's hard to be objective about it. Finding a box of family letters. The dead say little in their letters they haven't said before. We find no secrets, and yet how different every sentence sounds heard across the years. My father breaks my heart simply by being so young and handsome. He's half my age with jet black hair. Look at him in his Navy uniform, grinning beside his dive bomber. Come back, Dad, I want to say. He says he misses all of us, though I haven't yet been born. He writes from places I never knew he saw, and everyone he mentions now is dead. There is a large, long photograph, curled like a diploma, a banquet 60 years ago. My parents sit uncomfortably among tables of dark-suited strangers. The mildewed paper reeks of regret. I wonder what song this band was playing just out of frame as the photographer arranged your smiles. A waltz? A foxtrot? Get out there on the floor and dance. You don't have forever. What does it cost to send a postcard to the underworld? I'll buy a penny stamp from World War II and mail it downtown at the old post office, just as the courthouse clock strikes 12. Surely the ghost of some postal worker still makes his nightly rounds, his routine too tedious for him to notice when it ended. He works so slowly, he moves back in time, carrying our dead letters to their lost addresses. It's silly to get sentimental. The dead have moved on, and so should we. But isn't it equally simple-minded to miss the special expertise of the departed in qualifying our long-term plans? They never let us forget the line between them and us is only temporary. Get out there and dance, the letters shout, adding, love always, can't wait to get home. And soon we will be. See you there. Maybe I'll just read 2.5 more poems, or 2 1/8 poems. I'll start with the 1/8. A friend of mine had run a press that I'd helped him with. It was one of these letter presses, did beautiful editions. And I said, and he was shutting it down. He was just, his shoulders were just too old to keep pulling the hand press handle. And so I said, well, why don't the last one we publish is I'll write an epitaph for you, and you can write it, and I'll write it for myself, and we'll just publish our own epitaphs. And so this is my epitaph. It's only 2 lines long. Here lies D.G., a poet. Who can say? He didn't even have an MFA.
That was good.
So, and now I'm going to just, with 2 love poems. One was a poem that Carl asked me, he remembered it from another reading, and as I told somebody else, once burned, he was not twice shy. This is a poem. Once again, this is a poem. I wrote this, and I liked it. The ending seemed it needed an ending, and I gave it an ending. The ending was very good, but it was the wrong ending for the poem. So I just took it off, and I just waited a couple of years, and then the right ending came. It's called Summer Storm. It takes place at a wedding. Where you rent a facility. So I talk about a rented patio. That's what I'm talking about. I think I know it by heart. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry, and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars. The storm hit from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers, as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as swiftly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the crowd. Aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word, except to say good night. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm? A party 30 years ago. Its disappointments warm. There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried. Other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married, and memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life might be happier just by being different. I try to keep my family out of my poems. I think it just made, I wrote a poem about my mother early on, and she told me if I ever wrote another one, she would kill me. Which in her case was not an idle threat. So when I brought my selected poems out, I really felt that I should write a poem for my wife. And so I ended the book with this poem. And I should explain it in this, and I think you all know this, but it's always worth reminding. When you make a life with someone, you're deeply in love with someone, the two of you create a private language. And it is the most intimate form of communication you'll ever have with another person. It's also the most vulnerable, because if you lose the other person, who do you speak it with? And it reminded me of these California Indian tribes where there's only one or two speakers left. And when that person dies, the songs go, the dances go, the language is dead. And so the question is, well, does that make this language, does it make that love not worthwhile? No, it's just the nature of what it is. It's called marriage of many years. Most of what happens beyond words. The lexicon of lip and fingertip defies translation into common speech. I recognize the musk of your dark hair. It always thrills me, though I can't describe it. My finger on your thigh does not touch skin. It touches your skin, warming to my touch. You are a language I have learned by heart. This intimate patois will vanish with us. It's only native speakers. Does it matter? Our tribal chants, our dances round the fire, performed the sorcery we most required. They bound us in a spell time could not break. Let the young vaunt their ecstasy. We keep our tribe of two in sovereign secrecy. What must be lost was never lost on us. Thank you so much. Should we do some questions?
Questions?
Yeah,
Yes.
if you have any, yes.
Talk to us about being a poet laureate for California. What was the most interesting thing about your position?
Well, the completely haphazard manner in which it was conducted. You know, they put these things out. So, you know, apply to be poet laureate, and I said, you know, I'm just, you know, I write very honest reviews. I'm kind of outside the poetry game. I said, I'm not going to bother to apply because they'll never give it to me. So a college girl wrote me and said that she wanted to nominate me, but I had to grant her permission to do it. And I said, you really shouldn't. It's a waste of time. She said, I want to do it. And so I said, fine, you can do it. And then a teacher, a junior college teacher, nominated me too. And so didn't hear anything, no surprise. About 7 months later, I get an email from the Capitol, you know, from this young woman who says that they want me to come and interview. And so, you know, so I said, oh, do you have a short list? They said, no, we want to interview everyone. That's, you know, all 185 people. So I mentioned this to my wife over lunch, and I said, I'm not going to drive to Sacramento and back, you know, for a cattle call. I said, you know, it's just waste of time. And she says, no, you're going to do it. And I said, well, why? She goes, well, there's the white-faced ibis that is nesting at a swamp just outside of Sacramento. And I was going to ask you to take me there, but I figured not, you should do this. And so I said, I don't really want to. And she said, I want to see this, you know, this white-faced ibis. So I drive, you know, to Sacramento in a very nice suit. I talk to two bewildered young women, and then I drive to the swamp. I undress in the back seat, and then we slosh through the mud. But it was a good day. We even saw a river otter, and you know, we saw dozens and dozens of interesting birds and lots of ibis. So I came back. I don't hear anything. Don't hear anything. 6 months. I figure they must be, you know, still hanging. So one afternoon, the phone rings, and they say, "Is this Dana Gioia?" And I say, "Yes, it is." And they go, "Did you go to high school in Compton?" I said, "No, I went to high school in Gardena, California, on Compton Boulevard." They go, "Okay, thank you." And I said, "What's this for?" You know, what's this for? And I said, "Well, you know, we're trying to decide the laureate." I said, "Do you have a short list?" He said, "Oh no, we haven't got the short list yet." So I go, "Thank you." Put it down. Next afternoon, the phone rings. And they go, "Is this Dana Gioia?" And I said, "Yeah." They go, "You've been chosen the poet laureate of California. And you should have a project." I said, "Well, what are you going to tell the press?" They go, "Oh, in 15 minutes. So that was, that's the process, you know. And I think, you know, I think Jerry Brown was impressed with what I did in Washington. And I'm not sure, and it was probably somebody on the committee who liked my poetry. Now, they asked me what my goal was, and I knew I didn't need more than 50 minutes. I knew what it would be. And it came out of the NEA. When I went to the NEA, I realized that there was about 7 or 8 areas that got all the federal money, and the rest of the country got nothing. They were, and I asked the staff, they said, "Well, there's nothing in Savannah, Georgia worth, supporting." And I go, "Savannah, Georgia? Nothing in the South worth, you know." And I just said, "No, we're gonna have at least one grant in every congressional district." Now people say, "Well, choice of political," it has nothing to do with political, it's about democracy. If you've got 750,000 people, you have artists that are doing something interesting. Just because you can't find them doesn't mean they don't exist. And we did that, and immediately the public liked it, the press liked it, Congress liked it, and people liked it. You know, we would go there, so in my chairmanship, we gave mostly first grants, to things. And if we did a program, the program went to all 50 states. They said, well, we can't do all 50 states. I said, well, we're not gonna do the program then. And we find a way of doing it. But anyway, so I said, I wanna go to all 58 counties of California. Now, I don't know if you know California counties, but it's an easy way of saying it. Los Angeles County has 10 million people. What's the smallest county? Does anybody know? Well, Modoc is one of them, but not Modoc's. Next, it's not far from Modoc. Alpine. How many people does Alpine County have? 1,400. Sierra County has 2,000. And so I said, I'm gonna go to every county in California, and in every place I I go there, I'm gonna give a reading as part of a program of local people. And I said, so I want the high school kids that are in Poetry Out Loud to recite their poems. I want local poets to read. I want local musicians to play. And I didn't go anywhere in California where we had any trouble finding those people. And so I did 125 events. Now there's something that no one noticed about this, because literary people and cultural journalists are not very smart. Did 125 events. Now, I was working, I had a half-time appointment at USC then, because I had to pay both my boys' way through college. So I had to do an event at USC. Aside from USC, I did not do one significant university. I didn't go to the places they already had it. I went to public libraries, I went to community centers. Places that didn't have community centers, I went to the abandoned cinema or the old hotel or whatever, and we had a great time. And so that's what I did. And I met California. I thought I knew California. I didn't know half of California. So Modoc, Alpine, Sierra, these great things up, these tiny little counties up in the Sierras or down in the desert. And sometimes there was nobody there to host a reading, so we had to figure out a way of hosting it. But it was a great time. It was one of the great experiences of my life. But it was a lot of work. I mean, really for 3 years, I was living in my car. But that's what books on tape are made for. Okay, question? I guess yes.
Yes, you're widely published, and I wondered, can you talk a little bit about about how publishing poetry fits into this kind of emerging digital world?
Well, you will probably be surprised to hear me say this, but we are living in a great time for poetry. It's a terrible time for the novel. People are going back to what I would call like a secondary oral culture. They can read and they can write, but they prefer to get their information by sound. They want to listen to a podcast. They don't want to read an essay. They'll listen to the radio, rather than a book. Books on tape, which I think are as good as the books themselves. I mean, I know that's a debatable thing, but so poetry is an art that goes back before writing. And so the way that poets communicate things is the way that our culture right now is done. You say, well, but we don't do it. We don't, they won't put me on Saturday Night Live. Who cares? You can go on YouTube, you can do a podcast, you can do all of these things that people couldn't before. You can Zoom a reading. Now, that being said, I believe that as a poet, the most important thing you have is your physical body, inhabited, I presume, by your soul, in a real place, among real people, where you can respond to this. And I think it's not accidental that this whole notion of leading, being present in your own life has emerged as digital culture has triumphed. And so we have all the opportunities of technology that Homer would have died for. I mean, Homer had to hit his lute in the tavern or in the, a palace. Palace in Homer's age, the biggest room in it would be about 1/4 the size of this room. These were dumps. It's like, what was it? What's the bar I used to love called Red's Recovery Room? It's gone the way of all flesh, unfortunately. But Red's recovery room would have been the greatest palace in all of Greece, at Homer's time. And so we have that at our disposal, but what we have to do, we have to be conscious in terms of, I think, cultivating our presence and our engagement in our own life. And I think that, one of the things I like to do is the same thing every day. I write, and then I have 20 acres, and I go out and I prune a tree, I cut brush, and every day nature's done something that wasn't there yesterday. I start remembering, where, I saw this wildflower on one hill 10 years ago, and it's migrating across the other hills. The fire was terrifying, but I was not compensated for, but I was rewarded by seeing how nature heals itself. And that was a thrilling thing, slow but thrilling. And so I think we're in a, as I said, I always live 2 lives, and I think we should live at least 2 lives. But one of them is to be present in a broader world, but the other one is to be present in our own life, because it's irreplaceable. It's the most precious, irreplaceable gift that is given to you, and it doesn't let get out there on the floor and dance. It doesn't last ever. I forgot to tell you about this. Years later, I get an email and saying that this guy named Paul Kelly has turned that poem into a song. He's written his own lyrics around it, but he's taken these things, and would I give him permission? And I said, well, I guess let me think about it. So I wrote a friend of mine. I said, you know who Paul Kelly is? And he goes, he's the Bob Dylan of Australia. So I said, yeah, I'll let you do it. And it's this terrific song. And it's about his family in Australia. He's even done he's done YouTubes of it. One straight music, the other one was his family pictures. And what I like about it, and I was talking to Carl about this, which is that the most important thing I learned as a poet, and I learned this relatively, midway through my career, is not to tell the reader everything. Leave things out of your poem that the reader has to supply from his or her own life so that they can make it their own. And then I began to realize that poetry is an art. The reason poems are harder to read is that you have to put more of yourself into them. And so you have to do this. The typical poem nowadays is, I was in Pittsburgh and it was raining and I missed Trudy and I was reading Garcia Lorca and I felt bad for myself, and they tell you every possible thing, and then once that's over, they tell you how to interpret it. Sometimes those poems are interesting, but I don't think that's what poetry is. Poetry is an art of enchantment. I'm creating a story, a tune, which invites you to complete it, to sing in harmony or to sing in counterpoint with it. And there's if I could read one more poem, I want to tell you an odd story. I was invited to I never go to my Stanford reunions. I just, the people that I like don't show up or they've died. But actually it's the girl that's in the apple orchard called me up and she wanted me to come there. She's married to I don't know what she sees in the guy. He's rich, handsome, and nice. And I said, okay, I'll, where is it? Here, it's imagination. And so I went there, and I talked to her for about 5 minutes, and then she disappears, and and then I'm talking to people that I should have something in common with, but I don't. And I feel like I'm not present in my own life. Isn't it in this book? You see, maybe I don't have it here. And so I wrote this book called Reunion, and it's really it's a kind of a Twilight Zone poem. I'm there, and this is my life where no one knows me. These are my friends whom I can't name. Here's the field where no one shows me. The face is different, the voice is the same. Who is this stranger who rises to greet me? What is the joke that makes him smile as he brings forward his children to meet me? And so I'm going, and I'm talking about this and this thing, and it's a nice poem. It's a nice kind of mysterious poem, And then I'm at a reading years later, and this other woman I know from Stanford, beautiful woman from Hawaii whom I knew there. She comes up to me, and she has my poem framed.
Oh.
And I go, wow, that's incredible. You know, I mean, it's, compliment. Then, and she talks about how much she likes this poem. Oh, here it is, 163. Let me read it to you. It's not that long, then I'll shut up. Because I want you to have it fresh where you know. So for me, what's it about? It's about me being a bitchy guy who goes to his reunion and doesn't like anybody and feels sorry for himself and feels this second-rate alienation, which I hope I turn to first-rate alienation, not in the course of the poem, but reunion. This is my past where no one knows me. These are my friends whom I can't name. Here in a field where no one chose me. The face is older, the voice is the same. Why does this stranger rise to greet me? What is the joke that makes him smile as he calls the children together to meet me, bringing them forward in single file? I nod, pretending to recognize them, not knowing exactly what I should say. Why does my presence seem to surprise them? Who is the woman who turns away? Is this my home or an illusion? The bread on the table smells achingly real. Must I at last solve my confusion? Or is confusion all I can feel? So anyway, so I'm feeling very good. And then she turns the, good, he's given up on me.
I gotcha.
All the rest of humanity has come to that same conclusion. And so she turns it over, and there's a picture of an older man. She goes, "This is my father. He has Alzheimer's." And this poem explained to me how he must experience his life. And everything in my poem makes sense that way. And I said to myself, I think I like her interpretation better than my own. But I think that's what a poem should do. Somebody should be able to bring the needs of their own life and have the poem make sense with that. Let me do one more question, and then I'll call it quits. Do we have anybody else that has?
I have an odd question. In the poem Summer Storm, I was following your imagery very carefully. And it got to one place where I couldn't flush out the imagery.
Okay.
And so it was incomplete. It disturbed me. So if you could just describe or show on someone.
What would you
when
do?
you touched your arm, what was that? What was that motion?
She goes, I'll read you the lines. I mean, it's, if I were paraphrasing it in the prose, would mean that she came onto you. People, when a woman touches your arm, it's saying, well, say something, you idiot. And to my surprise, she took my arm, and then I said, a gesture, that we didn't explain. So we have this connection, but neither of us are saying anything about it. And then she goes back into the business of it. So it's the inkling of a romance, of a relationship that never went anywhere. And yet, for whatever reason, 30 years later, and this poem is not literally true. It's like two different events that happened to me that I put together and I made into a story. But it's about these things that, there are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried, other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And it's about that, and I think almost everybody has these, and it's not bad. I mean, every one of us could have had 100 different lives if we had done something different. We're going to school there, if we joined the Navy, if we moved to the job in Seattle, if we married somebody else. And so you have all these alternate lives, and you begin to imagine, and it's very unhealthy if you spend more time in your imagined lives than the one you have. But I think, and it's a way of I mean, for me, I had to get out of where I was from because, nobody was going anywhere there, so I have very few regrets about, that, although I do regret, having lost contact with a lot of people because of that. I moved around a lot in my life. But that's, I think, have I answered your question or just mystified you more?
Apparently I was not following part of the poem because for some reason I thought there were two men standing on the ground.
They could be two men, I have a composer, Lori Laitman, every poem of mine she does, she's, a woman, she's straight, but she wants to turn it into a gay drama. And my poems allow that, because I allow you to put whoever you want to in that thing, but it's, in my mind, it's a man and a woman, but it's only referred to as a you. So it could be two men, it could be two women, it could be two cats,
I thought of it as in terms of a friendship between two men, and so I lost it.
It could be. I mean,
Thank you.
There's nothing specifically erotic about it, and there's a certain eros of friendship, even. I mean, what was the term? A bro. Romance. Yeah. That's your question.
So what you're saying is it's good to leave the ambiguity in the line.
It's good to leave meaningful ambiguity. See, why does it? If I can make the assumption, and it's a huge assumption, that this poem works. Okay, why does it work when I have so much inspecificity? About the gender, the emotional nature of this, that, and the other. It's because, first of all, I create a tune, and then I create a story, and then I create the story is a little thing at the end with a reflection on the story, and so the narrative arc completes itself, although the details, are this. I mean, I bet everybody in the room has something they remember in the past that was like this, and it just depends. It depends, what it was for you that you put that there. It's like I also say, for me, it's clearly a wedding because it's a rented thing, but you might rent a place for it. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. I don't say wedding until the next stanza where I say, you were, the groom and then the bride. So even that, I don't. To pity the beautiful. I'm talking about archetypes. The poem was inspired by a very specific thing in my life. A beautiful, beautiful woman I know who had died at 50. And she was so beautiful, everybody did everything in the world for her until her beauty began to fade, and then she was just left on her own, and she wasn't tough enough to be on her own. So that was behind it, but I didn't want to bring her into it. I respected her, so I just took the impulse, and made it almost mythological. I think we should take a break because I've talked for a very long time. Thank you so much.
Wow. Yes. Oh my gosh. One of the things, I'm sorry, I'm a loudspeaker, that was so impactful to me and such a reminder is that writing is such a conversation with your reader. So you can tell, like, some of the things that he wrote, that there's all these different interpretations where he may have one meaning, but the reader is reading something else. So like the poem where you're talking about a reunion and someone saw their father in that is just like, oh, that's a gut wrench right there. That's really amazing. And that's the power that we have as writers as well, that when you're writing, you're not just writing for yourself, you're writing for the person that's reading your writing. We're so grateful to have you here. We have a couple of gifts for you. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want the wine too? Or
Absolutely.
Never know.
Bring me the corkscrew.
We have the California Writers Club has created Vision in Verse, which is pictures that
It's an ekphrastic poetry book.
Ekphrastic
Yeah.
poetry. And also, the smalls are very short poems and short prose that,
So how many of you are in?
Oh, they're in,
It-
people are in,
So I can
yeah.
read, all you are
You'll
good,
be
good.
reading us for sure.
Yeah, so-
We're the most prevalent in all the books.
Well, you should come up
In
and
the club.
sign your poem, just so I, you know.
Yeah,
So when we go to the break,
No.
if you want to, come over here and sign
You can
your
even draw a
poem.
little self-portrait that way.
And the other thing that we'd be honored to offer you, if you'll accept, is an honorary membership to Redwood Writers and
Well,
the
thank you.
California
Very
Writers
nice.
Club. Thank you so much. So we'll be in contact with you about that.